Hello and welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today on the podcast, I want to talk about borrowed nostalgia. We had a conversation here about a week or so ago with Spencer Shaw about nostalgia and how it all plays into marketing and the power of AI and all this other stuff. And it got me thinking about the idea of borrowed nostalgia. And when I think back to the 80s, the 90s, or even what I remember of even like the late 70s, I think about what it was like to live in that time, to actually see, Michael Jackson's Thriller launch the way it did, to actually see those John Hughes movies, to kind of live through it provides a much deeper and a much different perspective. So when you think about the idea of borrowed nostalgia, how does, Gen Z or even millennials or younger people, how do they have such an affection for something that they didn't fully experience? So it's interesting to me as to what it is that attracts them to these things and why they look at it in a way that, they appreciate it, I would say, just as much as anybody else, but how do they appreciate it when they weren't there? So what really is borrowed nostalgia and why does it work, on people who weren't there? What I think about is, why is a 22-year-old buying a film camera or even like looking at purchasing or wearing a retro Walkman right now? Ideas about, old cars. You see a lot of different videos on TikTok where people are wanting to buy cars from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and not necessarily classic cars, just cars that carry a certain kind of nostalgia from that time frame. Vinyl is obviously a huge thing that's coming back. You're seeing it now actually being remastered and repurposed and resold in stores. The idea of disposable cameras, flip phones are even making a comeback. So these are all the things that I think we evolved and moved past some of these things for good reason, but now all of a sudden they're sexy again. There's something people are wanting to revisit. So again, coming back to this idea, what is it about that? What is it that's really kind of kicking in? For me, nostalgia is a feeling because it brings me back to those times and those points in history where I actually remember. And I think for people today, the younger people who are buying into this idea of nostalgia, I think for them it's a feeling of retro and not necessarily tethered to a memory like it is for somebody like myself. I think in a roundabout way, they inherited a culture or they're looking back on a culture that maybe they experienced through the eyes of their parents and old photos and movies. And maybe it's even the music that their parents are listening to. I think there's an emotional shortcut there of a simpler time. I think when people look back at their parents and they see them all of a sudden, wow, my parents were actually cool back in the 80s, those kinds of things. I think there's a warmth. I think there's a simplicity. And I think there's a lot of respect that gets paid back to those times because people kind of respect the fact that it was a slower world. And I think things were, like I said, a little bit more simple, but they were also a little bit more exciting from a pop culture perspective. So maybe the question is really about whether or not borrowed nostalgia is it about the past? Is it about honoring that time frame in the world of time, or is it really about something else, maybe something missing in the present? Are we craving more of an analog existence versus a digital? With the influx of AI and everything that's going on there, are we kind of looking at that old flip phone and thinking, man, that would have been pretty sweet? Are we attracted to the imperfections and maybe just the texture of what was the 80s and the 90s and being able to look back at some of those things and feel more comfortable? Because let's face it, you could work on your own cars back then. Now you can't. Everything's more computerized. So again, are we buying a mood and not a product? Or is it just looking at a much more simple time and getting emotional about it? And are we figuring that out as consumers, but also are brands leaning into that to try to capture that within us and draw us closer to that idea and that emotion that they're trying to portray with some of these retro nostalgia type campaigns? So all that said, if you're really paying attention, look at what the brands are doing. How are they actually using this right now to try to draw our attention? If you look at a lot of major brands, they're using throwback logos. They're using retro or heritage type packaging, even color palettes, a graininess to the different video aspects that they're doing. I just read an article the other day how DVDs and VHSs are coming back. So there's a texture to it, and those of us who lived through the VHS era, there's a texture on those VHS cassettes when you watched a movie. And it seemed oh so normal at the time, but they're going back to that. You think of the vinyl versus CD versus streaming. People actually are going back and wanting those clicks and pops and white noise of vinyl records because it takes them to that nostalgic place. So again, brands are now using some of these tactics to draw us in and to revive, something that's inside of us that wants these products, that wants these campaigns so that they can tap into this nostalgic feeling across the board with consumers. Now, coming from a guy who actually, like, I love nostalgia, everything from movies, music, Air Jordans, cars, you name it, like, that's my world. And the question I have in this whole thing is where's the line? Where does this whole idea of borrowed nostalgia, the idea of playing off these amazing things, when does it become kind of a gimmick or, where's the line where it crosses over to possibly even pandering? Like I said, a lot of brands are slapping retro filters on there. They're throwing old logos out there, but are they truly tapping into the nostalgia and the charm of it all? I'm not sure, but that's the question. So what makes nostalgia marketing feel authentic instead of cheap? Personally, I think it needs to have a genuine connection to the era or its values. I think it should tell a story. I love it when a brand actually maybe steps back into a retro logo or maybe even reuses an old commercial that, kind of tells a story and they pay homage to the fact that they've been in, a certain industry or business for a number of years. I think back, and you can Google these, there's probably all kinds of great examples out there, but like you think back to the old Taster's Choice or Folgers commercials that they used to do during the holidays. There was a very consistent vibe about how they told those stories, and they don't necessarily do that the same, but those nostalgic feelings of how they pull that, or even like an old Coca-Cola, holiday commercial. There's something there that when they're telling a story and they're being authentic about it, and it's not just a one-off, grab at a trend, I think there's a lot of value there. And I think there's a lot of mileage there if done correctly. Extra points for being able to reference those things, connect it to a broader story, and being able to maybe morph it into a new story of how nostalgia and how those efforts in the past paved the way for where they are today. So does a brand actually need this history to do this? Do they actually need X amount of years in the business to accomplish this? Personally, I don't think so, because every brand, every story, and even the consumer relation with that brand, there's always a feeling of connection there, and there's always a backstory behind it all. That's the launch pad of how to use nostalgia to move your brand and to move your business forward. So this begs the question of whether or not can a brand new company use nostalgia if it's never lived or if it's never experienced this kind of feeling or this history behind their brand. And honestly, I think new brands are building on this feeling now, today. I think they're building on this feeling rather than trying to prove it over the course of time or even tapping into maybe some historical value they might have about their business. I think it's the idea of borrowing an emotion from an era. There's obviously clever ways to do it and kind of to pull it off, but you could bake, this idea of nostalgia, this idea of retro into the branding, into the messaging, into the voice, into even the look and feel of the business, even though they have not been there or even experienced that long of life to be able to claim, some kind of retro nostalgia vibe. It's more of a strategy now. So bottom line is it's really about who you are and how you might pay respects to nostalgia and bake that into your existing brand. So at the end of the day, who is this really landing with? I think personally, I think it resonates super hard with younger audiences specifically because this nostalgia is kind of for everybody. And I think nostalgia is kind of a trend, but I think it lives in movies. It lives in music. I think it lives in all these different things that kids naturally kind of migrate to all day, every day. But it's also kind of anti kind of technology in a way. The thing about, a lot of these things is you couldn't pay homage to the 80s when you were in the 80s because you were in it. Now, fast forward 30, 40, 50 years, you're able to look back at these times and truly analyze it for what it is and create these campaigns of homage and actually grab different pieces and play them to your benefit. So like one of the things you'll just inherently notice about Cyberdogz is that I'm retro. I just live the retro vibe every day. I'm in that stuff every day. So you'll see things in the background of my office. You'll pick up on references I make. Maybe even it might be catchphrases or sarcasms, but you're just going to naturally catch it from me because it's natural and it's authentic for me to throw those things in there because I'm doing it every day. One of our sister companies, like Dog Days Apparel, we actually built that on the idea of paying homage to not only, brands and vibes and businesses that were from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but each individual logo pays an homage to specific instances in time or memories that maybe I had or even somebody has shared with us where we've created a t-shirt or a logo mark around it. So those are just a couple examples where you can see it. It's out there. It's working. It's doing its thing. It's not just Nike. It's not just Coca-Cola. It's not just the big brands who can benefit from it. I think it's any company in any industry that wants, to use part of that nostalgia play as an ingredient in their brand recipe. So the challenge is how do you do this without becoming too gimmicky? How do you build borrowed nostalgia into the brand and do it the right way? That's really the question. And to be honest, I'm not sure there is a right way or a wrong way because it depends on you, the individual, or your brand or company that you're trying to bake it into. I do, however, think it starts with the feeling you want to invoke. I think where do you want to go with this and what feeling is it that you're trying to kind of get out of it? Is it trust? Is it the fact that you've been around for a while? Is it quality? What is it that you're trying to kind of push through on that message? And then from there, build the visuals around that, make it look, feel, and represent the vibe that you're trying to put out there. I also think it needs to tie into something true and authentic about your brand. So think back to your story. Think back to why you started your business. Think back to the things that attracted you to wanting to do this at all. Those are probably the answers you need and the keys to identifying those different aspects of borrowed nostalgia that you might want to slip into your own brand. And then I think at the end of the day, you have to commit to it. Because if it's authentic and it's true and it's really tied to your brand, you need to commit to it and not trend hop with it. It needs to become part of who you are. On that note, I will say when we first started Cyberdogz, I got a lot of questions from people asking why certain things mattered. Well, why are you doing that? How does that help you? Why are you doing X, Y, and Z? What's that have to do with marketing? I would get those questions all the time. And I just wanted to do it the way I wanted to do it. And I wanted to do it in a way that was authentic to me and my brand and my mission and the way that we started kind of marketing ourselves. So it seemed a little out of place at times. And I completely understood that, but I committed to it. And now it's just a part of our DNA. And I think that's my point is that's the big thing is you have to commit to it and not give up on it, because if you do it right, it's going to be authentic and in a very true aspect of your brand. So that said, and the big question is nostalgia just a trend or is it something that's permanent? Personally, I feel like, yeah, it's a little trendy. I think people are latching onto it and then maybe lack of a better word, exploiting it to a degree. But I also think nostalgia is permanent. I think every generation that passes, every decade that passes, I think people look back at the previous and there's some charming aspects of every decade that people miss. They kind of wish it was the same. If you think about, we already talked about vinyl and music and VHS and all these different things, but even think back to the shows you're watching. Think about the phenomenon that is Stranger Things. That whole thing is nothing but one continuous retro vibe. They could have very easily created that show in a modern time and probably accomplished much of the same aspects of the story. But the retro vibe of Stranger Things, the way they dressed, the different, the Walkman, the pizza delivery, the cars they drove, every aspect of nostalgia that oozed out of that show became kind of pop culture trendy again. So the idea of nostalgia being a trend or permanent, I definitely think it's more of a permanent thing. I think it's going to be around for a long, long time. And the reason why is because I think people love simple. I think they love looking back at a less technical time, a more analog time. And I think it's a way for people and brands to feel very grounded and feel very relatable.